Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have this session with Jenny Coombs. This has been a really great time because we had another session with Jenny about a year ago almost, and I really wanted to bring Jenny back because she did such a great job in giving a broad overview of the industry and sharing a lot of insights for you to learn more about the topic. And so I'll let Jenny go deeper into that, but I did want to give a plug to the really great resources that she does through USSIF. And you haven't seen USSIF yet, I'll be sharing more resources from them on the different courses that they do and also the research that they publish. And so I know Jenny's working closely with them. But Jenny works for Ethos ESG. And so she can tell us a little bit more about the work that she does and the really great resources that she'll have to share with you all today. Thanks very much for being here. And Jenny, I'll hand it over to you and you can share some more.
Sure, will do. Thanks, Stephen. Hello, everybody. It's so great to see you. I'll admit I actually looked a little bit at your backgrounds before joining the meeting today, and I have to say you guys are really impressive. I don't know what the heck I could possibly teach you that you don't already know, so this is going to be difficult on my end. I'm just kidding, but I seriously, I'm very impressed by all of you. This is really an honor to be here, and I'm so happy that Stephen invited me back to speak with you today. And one thing that Stephen didn't mention is that in my in-between of working with SIF and then also working with Ethos is I did teach for about 6 years with the College for Financial Planning. So I did work as an associate professor with the College for Financial Planning and developed a lot of material related to sustainable investing. And some of this material is snippets of that I find is pretty useful for just about anybody who is interested in the space or wants to consider potentially going into sustainable investing or just sustainability in general. So hopefully that'll be a good takeaway for you today. So let me find my screen first and foremost, because that's what Zoom is all about. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So I titled this Making Sustainable Shareholders and Impactful Stakeholders. And I'll use those two terms a lot in this, differentiating between people who are active owners of equity within a company versus those that are part of the world at large who lend themselves to giving legitimacy to a company. And really, we all have a role to play in this, not just those that actively own shares of companies. It's really all of us working together on that. And whenever I go through one of these presentations, I try to come up with something that I want you to walk away with. Usually, it's not just me willy-nilly spilling out facts to you and hopefully take a fact and run with it. But really what I want you to think about as we go through all of this is just to understand the role that we play as stakeholders in the world. That we, by understanding this material really though, we have the ability to shift the way we think about economics overall. Economics really drives a lot of what we do. So it really drives everything that we do, right? So when we think about how we can improve economics overall, it really shifts our societal impacts and how we conduct business across the globe. So when we're, considering all of those factors, that's something I hope, in your respective industries that you'll walk away with here today. Because when I did look at your resumes, I noticed that a lot of you are in, not just in finance, but also in like legal, corporate, philanthropic, some in political spheres. All of this can be applicable in sustainable investments in some capacity. So don't get too bogged down with the details here. I just like to be organized and break up into parts where we're going to cover today. I'll focus really the most of it on parts 1 and 2, really setting the stage for where we're beginning in terms of the economic world, giving you a brief history on sustainable investing, and then talking about an area that I've actually developed over the years in terms of how to work with investors. And actually, something you can think about yourself in terms of how you would categorize yourself as a person interested in sustainable investing or just interested in sustainability in general. And then a little bit of details on how these strategies work, how they progressed, and then also, why this information is all important and relevant today. And if I have time, hopefully I'll just give you a little shameless plug about ethos, because I think this is some piece about ethos that I think you'll have fun with if you do take an interest afterwards to check it out. So I'll begin with talking about the this notion that every stakeholder is, in my view, an investor. It's true that all shareholders are stakeholders, but not all stakeholders are necessarily shareholders. But I believe that all stakeholders are actually some kind of investor, and whatever they do and whatever they think and wherever they put their money in general is really important. So, I could go through this section and cite a lot of sources on things like the urgency of climate change, but I feel like all of you already know that and know the importance of that. So in this section, I really wanted to give you some ideas about when you make the argument to those who don't really see it as an issue, that might happen in some cases. I know that in the United States, that is the case. And for some of you in some other parts of the world, you're like, of course, this is an issue. It's not up for debate. Climate change is an issue. There are ways to explain it to folks in a way that'll make sense from a business perspective. And this is just one more tool to have in your toolkit of making sure that you can explain this in a way that's rooted in economic theory. I like it to have this, set up. My husband's actually German, and I'm sure the Germans have a word for it. It's like the process of making somebody else think that the idea was theirs. I have no idea what that could possibly be, but this is kind of what this section is meant to be. So these are some economic theories. I promise they'll be fun. I tried to make them interesting for you. So let's talk about a few of them first. The first one I'll look at here is what's known as legitimacy theory. So big concept that we'll look at here is essentially that shareholders are the ones that give companies money, but stakeholders are the ones that give companies legitimacy. And smart companies remember that shareholders are the ones that give them both of those things. An example of a company that forgot about this recently is Boeing. They spent a lot of time in the last, 20, 30 years or so focused so much on shareholders. They lapse their judgment in safety issues, which really affects the stakeholders. And, there's more than one airline manufacturer in the world these days. So, there's legitimacy issues that have to be recognized by companies like Boeing. But let's talk about legitimacy itself. So legitimacy theory, as it's defined here, was actually created in 1995 by an American sociologist named Mark Suchman. Essentially, from a corporate perspective, what it means is that if I'm a company, I'm given permission from society to operate among people. If a company wants to use natural resources, hire employees, build offices, exist at all within a community, their actions are going to be held accountable by society. For whatever reason, if society feels like they breached this unspoken social contract, then the survival of that company is going to be in jeopardy. We can really pull out this card and show companies that, hey, we lend you legitimacy. You don't just exist in a vacuum. We provide you with all of the resources to exist among us. And when we look at companies from that point of view, it puts it in a different light. We as stakeholders in this world hold the power over those organizations. And contrast this with what's known as stakeholder theory. So that we're making a little bit of a shift here from legitimacy now directly into the stakeholders themselves. So that takes legitimacy and twists it a little bit more. Edward Friedman came up with this theory, not to be confused with Milton Friedman. A little bit different spelling of the last name. Milton Friedman was an economist who basically let's see if I can summarize this in a nutshell. His view of capitalism was essentially that companies need to maximize profits for the benefit of shareholders, and the paying attention to any externalities that were caused by, harm or anything that was caused by obtaining profits for those shareholders is not important. What's important is just making money for those shareholders. And what this is saying essentially is that it stresses that broader relationship between a business and the whole supply chain. So customers, suppliers, employees, investors, communities, all the stakeholders ultimately are the ones that create value. It's not just the ones that are holding the company's stock. So it's basically like thinking about it like a giant iceberg here. So what we think about the shareholders and what, from a capitalistic point of view, they're only, being impacted by what's on the surface. A company is only seeing what they're experiencing on the surface, when in reality, there's a lot more interested parties that are well below the water. And this is, for everybody's sake, we're lending legitimacy, but recognizing that it is impacting a lot of individuals at once. You'll notice that I've not talked about climate change yet. So this is all fun for you to be able to use in your arsenal. So another theory that we can also use is a fun one. It's called the X curve of transition dynamics. Sounds real technical, but it's not. It's very simple. If you think for a second, just in your mind, you don't need to come up with one. Think about an industry that has not changed at all since the Middle Ages. How about the 18th century or the 19th century? How about 100 years ago? How about 50 years ago? How about 20 years ago? I don't think there's any industry that hasn't changed at some point in time within the last 20 years. And really what the point of this transition dynamics is meant to do is that businesses that don't rise with changes that are meant to replace unsustainable practices will fail. And if they don't, they just will fail. They'll be replaced by something that does it better and does it more sustainably. So the fact that you have companies, i.e. a lot of oil companies, will say, energy companies that are just not diversifying their portfolios enough to match, a more sustainable model, are just going to fail. That's the reality of it. One that I give, especially with this one that's not climate related, is if you think about Blockbuster Video, if any of you are old enough to remember that, and Netflix. Blockbuster was a physical store location that you should go to rent movies and DVDs, and that you'd have to bring them back afterwards. Well, Netflix came along and did everything streaming via the internet. And that ultimately became what we have today, right? There is no physically going out to a store and obtaining something to watch. I can simply do it on my phone or computer. And this cross happens where there's just no change that's being adapted. You start to see a breakdown and a phase out of the industry that was in existence, and a better one comes along and replaces it. So the ones that don't go ahead and make the change to ride that wave and stay above to that top portion of the X ultimately will fail. Now this is, you don't need to note mathematics here, because this formula doesn't actually add up to legit math, but really it's meant to be symbolic here. And that's to note that in sustainable finance, the integrated value of something is the sum of a couple different things. It's environmental value, so how it is perceived in terms of its harm or its help to the world at large. Its social value, does it harm or help society? And then its financial value. So that's the book value that we would see, business as usual be presented to us in the form of, say, a 10K or some kind of financial statement. The sum of all of those is what's known as the integrated value. And really, smart economies are recognizing that the combination of these things are important to be reported to shareholders and then also to society at large. I apologize if this is a little bit blurry because I did have to stretch it out a little bit, this table, but that formula you'll see is right smack in the middle. It's what's known as Sustainable Finance 2.0. There were a couple Dutch professors that specialize in sustainable finance, and they wrote a really great book actually a few years ago where they talk about this formula specifically. And economies that had been going along and just maximizing their profits, really going by that model that Milton Friedman had focused on, just maximizing financial profits, are that top line, finance as usual, which is just looking at the F. And that's really short-term thinking, ultimately, right? We're not looking at the long-term repercussions of our actions or even looking at externalities of any kind of harm that's caused by those. We're just looking at profits. Even Sustainable Finance 1.0 is also looking at short-term. Because you're looking at refined shareholder value, because you are considering societal impact, you are considering some environmental impact, but you're still looking to maximize the financial gains, even if it means costing a little bit of social factors and environmental factors at the same time. And then that regular sum formula that we're looking at is just meant to, again, it gives equal weight to each of those things, when in reality, we can't function in a world that doesn't have breathable air, drinkable water, survivable earth. And we can't function in a society where people are killing each other or there's inequality or any of these things. We have to recognize that all of that has to be in equilibrium before we can effectively focus on strong financial returns. So Sustainable Finance 3.0 is a goal that most of these more progressive economies are aiming for, which is looking at a common good value. It's not aiming to maximize financial returns, but instead is aiming to optimize societal good, environmental good, and then the financial returns that come out of that, awesome. They're not going to be the primary goal, but we want to make sure that those things are taken care of first, and then everything else is secondary. That is the long-term perspective. That is something that's going to withstand the test of time. And unfortunately, we live in a society, especially here in the US, where that's not necessarily the case. The last piece I'll take a look at here for you is a kind of a snippet of how we got into the situation of long-term consumerism. So post World War II, there was this drive to have society show that capitalism was really the way to go, and what the economists at the time were doing were trying to find strategies that would prove or show that there was a progression to the world, that, okay, the United States has reached a point where we're heavily evolved, and the evolved economies are the ones that are going towards capitalistic motivations. So W.W. Rostow was an economist who taught at MIT back in the 60s. In 1960, he wrote a book called The Stages of Economic Growth. The subtitle of that book was called A Non-Communist Manifesto. And actually, he ended up being a consultant to the John F. Kennedy administration. And part of that was implementing some of these thought processes in terms of how you would fight the Cold War, is that you would encourage capitalism to evolve in a way that was just going to reach high consumption. And if you look at these steps, I don't need to go through and define each one of these for you, but you kind of get the idea that you start off with, a basic society, things start to progress, and then you ultimately enter this age where everybody's just consuming, high mass consumption. And there's a glaringly obvious problem with this, right? What do you do after step 5? We can't just consume forever. There's no end to that. There has to be an end to that, or there has to be a cycle in some capacity. To go back to the beginning. And Rostow, fortunately, he was no dummy. He realized this mistake, and in the 1970s, he added a 6th step to this. And unfortunately, it was kind of sarcastic. It was really just in a nutshell, basically said, it's the next generation's problem to figure out, which is real nice, right? But if you look at the steps here, they're really reminisce of a plane taking off, right? I know I'm going back to plane analogies a lot. I used to be an industrials analyst, so I do talk about airplanes quite a bit. So forgive me for doing that. But ultimately, here's what his 6th step was. It was called the search for quality. I defined it as, basically it's the next generation's problem to figure out. But basically what he's saying here is that there's diminished returns in utility and the consumption of consumer goods. Ultimately, you'll reach a phase where things just aren't going to keep progressing, and then you'll have to figure out where to go from there. Basically, you're going to run into a situation where the plane is going to run out of fuel, and then what? Do you land? Do you crash? What do you do? That's essentially what he's left us with. So the economic model in a lot of cases, and in a lot of our textbooks too, is just showing that, line constantly upward. That's the progression that we always see, is that a straight line up is what progress looks like. When in reality, this is what it should look like, right? Think about it like a tree. It starts off really small, takes a long time to get to a full size, but then it just thrives forever. It can grow in perpetuity and make other trees. It can just live for a long time. It doesn't need to keep going up, but it can just live and be satisfied with that. And there's just not this notion, of course, in this society that we're ingrained with here, that satisfaction is part of that, which is a mentality that I think we need to shift with a little bit. So with some inspiration from some of these ideas, we'll talk now about how to get involved with that through some investments. And I'm sorry I'm not looking at the chat directly, but if there are questions, I promise I'll get to those. Just bear with me here, because I do have a tendency to go off on tangents if I do address the questions right in the middle there. So sorry about that. I will get to them, I promise. So let's talk a little bit about the history of SRI, ESG, SRI being sustainable investing. I'll get to that momentarily, but just to give you a quick snippet, the idea about sustainable investing is that it's not really a new concept. It's been around in some capacity in one form or another for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. The major world religions actually have some kind of root in a practice of investing with values. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam all have some kind of outline in terms of ethical money practices in their religious texts. But in 1758 is the first time that we actually start to see the term socially responsible investing being used. This was used by, we better know them as the Quakers. The Religious Society of Friends met at an annual meeting in Philadelphia for another fun fact is that Benjamin Franklin was actually a member of this organization. And they discussed at this meeting to not engage with businesses that were supporting the slave trade effectively. And if you read a biography too on Benjamin Franklin, you'll know that he was very anti-slavery, and ultimately it took another 100 years or so for that to be abolished in the United States. But this is an example of having a strategy being outlined by an organization, being outlined by a group of individuals who then took that and applied it to business practices. So that was in their outlined for them what socially responsible investing looked like. And then a year later, the first SRI strategy, as we know it, was outlined by a minister for the Methodist Church named John Wesley. He gave a famous sermon. You can actually look up the full text of the sermon online. It's called The Use of Money. And in here, he basically outlined what really it meant to, put values behind your monies. Basically, if you had anything extra to spare, that you should give it to causes or invest it into things that you would like to see thrive. And this idea then was something that then is kind of folded into the notion of philanthropy, but then also using that as part of an investing strategy. You'll note that philanthropy and investing are not one and the same, but it can be used as part of a broader financial plan, we'll say. And then just real briefly, in the 20th century and the 21st century, this is where things really started to take off. 20th century especially, there were a lot of social movements that really brought about changes that folded into the topic of investing, specifically the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement. And then in the 1980s is when you started to see environmental issues start folding into that conversation too. You started to hear the word ozone be thrown around quite a bit. And this is when we started to look at environmental factors and social factors together and say, okay, maybe there is something here related to a way that we can address all of these at the same time. So in the 21st century, this is when the United Nations started to get involved, and they had this desire to have institutions, specifically financial institutions, be the driver of sustainability initiatives, because they did control lending specifically to organizations. And because they did control all of the money, they wanted to focus on areas that would be less, well, I'll say less debatable in terms of the objectives that they were aiming to solve. So, hungry people was not something that really anyone was really going to fight against. So they tried to find causes that would be common among everybody. We recognize that these are problems. We're going to find ways to solve them. And thus, the UN Sustainable Development Goals were born out of that. 17 goals, 169 sub-targets, 232 different indicators. We use a whole bunch of these in Ethos actually to evaluate and create impact scores for different investments. The goal here was to create a better world specifically by the year 2030. They're a global strategy, although they're not formally implemented by governments. They do provide a framework that a lot of organizations can use to give a mission behind and achieve. The only one that doesn't necessarily have a level that is of its own is number 17, which is partnership for the goals. Effectively, if you happen to have an economy that somehow manages to achieve all 16 and they do so really well, number 17 is their obligation to share what they know with the rest of the world. And if there happens to be a country that gets to that point, that's the one that they will aim to focus on. So going back to uh, sustainable investing or socially responsible investing, I'll note that up until the early 2000s, this was the common term used throughout the industry. It was this is the broader definition that was used. It was an investment strategy that was looking to maximize financial returns at the same time enhancing societal good. The problem, though, was what exactly is societal good? If you ask 100 different people, you're going to get 100 different answers to what that means. And that was, troubling to folks. At the same time, too, we wanted to be a little bit more inclusive and not just focus primarily on the aspects that were outlined by the religious individuals from the 18th century, like we talked about previously. So there was a shift in the terminology to make it a little bit more all-inclusive. As it turns out, it happened to be the same acronym, SRI. So it was sustainable, responsible, and impact. But that became a big old mouthful. So the way that I and a lot of others in the industry today just abbreviate it, shorten it, we just simply call it sustainable investing, because honestly, the alternative would be unsustainable investing, and who the heck is going to support that? So, it's the terminology itself is a little bit more non-divisive. It's a lot simpler, and it's a lot more easier to explain. Simply put, it's an investing strategy that uses a combination of ESG criteria in order to do what most financial strategies aim to do: maximize financial returns and minimize risk. And when it comes to sustainable investing, there's a lot of options. I'm not going to define all of these here for you, but the idea really is that they're all classified under the same umbrella. You can have so many different ways to categorize sustainable investing. I'll use food analogies a lot too, in addition to airplanes. If you want to think about sustainable investing as like different types of cakes, there are a lot of different types of cakes out there. So they're all going to be classified as desserts in some capacity, but we just have a few different ways of serving them up. But on that same sleeve, if we want to talk about desserts, this is where we get into the topic of ESG. So to separate ESG out, we know that it stands for environmental, social, and governance. I'm sure all of you knew that already. This is the criteria that we use to set a series of standards in order to evaluate and create a sustainable investing strategy. So if we're talking about sustainable investing as being the cake, the ES and G are the eggs, flour, and sugar that go into making that cake. And you can rearrange them however you want. It's just the arrangement of those ingredients that result in the outcome of that cake in the end. And there are some that think that just by virtue of the fact that you've used those ingredients, that all of the cakes are going to come out looking exactly the same. That's not the case. As we know, just depends on whatever factors you've included in that. And also worth noting too that those are not the only ingredients that go into making a cake too. You do have to use other financial methods in order to make a portfolio. Some that are counter to the use of ESG forget this fact, and they think that that's the only thing that we're looking at. It's not. These are simply big ingredients that are going into creating something that is ultimately going to be the best portfolio for that client. If we're wondering where the heck ESG came about, it didn't just pop out of thin air a few years ago. It actually was developed or came about through the United Nations. So there was a paper that was published by then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan back in 2004, actually, not 2006. In 2004, he wrote a paper that, again, was looking at financial institutions to be the driver of promoting this type of social change. And in that paper, he broke down environmental, social, and economic factors but the repetition of the E was a little bit of a challenge, and they said, well, with economic factors, two governance issues are also folded into that as well, so we'll just call it G. So that's how ESG then became those criteria that we use. They evolved a little bit in the years following, but ultimately that became a method of measuring risk metrics as well as quality for portfolios. So the pieces that go into evaluating a portfolio, it's not limited to just these. This is just a sampling of it, but just to give you an idea, what are these pieces of criteria? Sometimes it's what a company does well. Sometimes it's where they could improve. So with corporate governance, things like board diversity, corruption, compensation for their executives, and social factors. It's going to be anything related to humans and human interactions with other humans. So labor relations, workplace safety, human rights, biases, how products are marketed to other human beings, community development, inequalities, racial injustices, the treatment of LGBTQ plus individuals. That whole sphere is one piece of the S. And then environmental is anything that affects the physical world that we live in: the sky, the water, the air, the earth, toxins that might pollute those, agriculture that we use to cultivate the land, carbon emissions, climate change, all of that under that E factor umbrella. So brief little snippet about the terminology. Now I'll talk a little bit about the types of sustainable investors. And I know I'm running a little bit short on time, but I'll speed it on up. I apologize for that. So the strategies for sustainable investing, typically there's 4 main strategies, and then the 5th one is kind of, it goes along with all of the, it supplements them. Corporate engagement is that piece. And usually corporate engagement is done through engagement of companies through shareholder activism, or voting proxies, or just generally working with companies to make them better. But there are, and most investors will use some combination of these. They're typically not used in isolation. Positive invest in class is basically including investments based on the things they do well. Negative and exclusionary is really the oldest strategy that we have. That's avoiding investments that I don't want included in my portfolio because of my own personal beliefs or ethics. Or just avoiding investments based off of the negative things that they're doing. The largest strategy used in the US currently is ESG integration. And this one gets a little bit of some blowback because it really is just focused on risk factors and not really looking too broadly at what companies necessarily do well. It's more focused on financial matters and really looking at, is it material in terms of being financially impactful for the company in general. And then sustainability themed investing is something that a lot of young individuals are focused on and really like today, and that's creating portfolios that aim to have a very specific goal in mind, like just investing in things that are going to support clean energy or green technologies or alternative fuels. They have a goal in mind. And then, like I mentioned, corporate engagement works with all of those. So like I mentioned before, this is a progression that I've actually come up with over the years. At its core, though, sustainable investing is an investing strategy, right? There's no such thing as an investing strategy that aims to lose money. So it doesn't make sense that you would say that sustainable investing would do so. And what I like to think about this as is you've got investors that start in the space and progress. I hate to use a pyramid because that sounds a little sketchy, so I'll just call it a mountain at this point. You've got investors that can start at the bottom of the mountain and then progress their way up. There is always building upon another level. There's never something in isolation. You're not aiming to do one thing without the other. The idea here really is that each level is adding something to the next. So when we're looking at ESG is aiming to maximize financial returns, and it's always an and, never an or. If you're taking anything away or eliminating anything other than risk from a portfolio or a risk from an investing strategy, you're doing it wrong. So there's not a one size fits all approach here. Really, the creation of this hierarchy was meant to show that you can just take that basic definition that we talked about previously for using sustainable investing, back a few slides, and then just keep tacking on to that definition. So the integration level, this is where most people are. If I could, readjust the sizes of these, that bottom portion of that pyramid would be probably the vast majority of it. Most investors are interested in sustainable investing just for the risk mitigation. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And ultimately, I'm okay with it just because they're here. They're interested in it in general. They see it as a quality check for their investments. And in some cases, it can be the tipping point between two otherwise identical investments. This one just happens to be a little bit more ethical on paper than this one. And I see that as a way in the door. If they see that and they recognize, okay, cool, I'm not losing money because I've got a quality portfolio here. Now what can I do further? Well, I can start investing for my values. I can do all of the factors that are outlined in the integration level, and then I can look at things that are, reflecting of my personal values, beliefs, things that I would like to see reflected in the world. Supporting the oceans, supporting women's rights, something along those lines, something added to that. Now, once you've moved all the way up, and I'm sure all of you guys are going to be here at some point, is reaching the pinnacle of this pyramid, which is the impact, where you've got everything down below. And now you're at the point where, okay, I've invested for my values, but now I want to see evidence that my money is influencing the environment, influencing social factors and governance factors. So at the impact stage, I really want to see what I'm doing with that money. And if I'm not seeing it in some way that can be reported to me, then I'm getting involved in things like shareholder advocacy methods. I'm making direct and meaningful changes with my investments and getting more involved. So any investor at any given time is at one of these three areas. And my purpose here really is to show that there is this progression of those investors. And once they're in the door in integration, they can go up. They really can. They don't tend to leave once they've entered into that bottom level. So the hope is that they stay there. Now, there's a little bit, I could talk all day about how wonderful and great ESG data is, but there's some limitations to it, of course. A few things just worth noting here is that, and probably the biggest one is just in a lot of cases, research firms have this lack of transparency. In a lot of cases, it's their bread and butter. They don't want to disclose it to the public. So they, keep it private. They make you pay for it, all of this. And that lends itself to a lot of distrust by the public, right? Because they're not sure if it's reliable or not. You're also in a position too of quantifying unquantifiable data in some cases. How do you put, a measurement on feelings or, if a company has a certain policy, what does that mean? Or how does that translate into dollars or potential growth? So all of that has to be calculated somehow. Sometimes there's too a lack of standardization across the globe. In the European Union, they've done a little bit of a better job in terms of making this into legislation so that it can be or have some kind of standard to it. But of course, we're not at a point across the world where that is the case. Some cases too, you have industry experts that disagree in terms of what's considered material or not. And then there's a whole slew of biases that can also pop up. Data that comes out of the EU tends to be a little bit more believable than data that comes out in other parts of the world in this sphere. Larger firms that have more resources tend to be more promoting or reporting on things like carbon emissions. And if a smaller firm doesn't have the resources to report on carbon emissions, then they'd say, oh, you don't want to invest in small cap companies because they're terrible. They're not reporting on these things. They just don't have the resources. So a lot of factors go into the creation of ESG scores. I'll note that Ethos has addressed pretty much all of these in some capacity, but there's, issues still in general with the market, with data. So why is all of this, important in general with sustainable investing? Here's a little snippet of stats. There's so many of them out there. I just, like to present a little bit of them. Morgan Stanley has a report that they present every 2 years, about generational interest in sustainable investing. They've noted that millennial investors specifically, I believe they now are reporting far more stats on Gen Z, that they have almost all of them, almost 100%, have some degree of interest in sustainable investing. That within the United States, USIF has noted that there are in the trillions of dollars of assets that are domiciled here that are solely focused on sustainable investing. They did have to adjust their methodology in recent years so that there wasn't some, companies saying that, oh yeah, we do focus on sustainable investing, but then didn't offer any proof. This is a far more reliable statistic because these are companies that offer evidence that, yeah, here's the strategies that we use to evaluate these investments. So, the headlines came out that the numbers and under investment in the US declined, when in reality, they just changed the methodology and made it a little bit more reliable. And the younger generations are far more likely to switch jobs over climate change concerns, something that older generations just weren't willing to do. And also noting too that when it comes to investments, the differences between traditional run-of-the-mill index funds and sustainable equity funds didn't have that much of a difference over volatile periods of time. Now, this is just taking a look at the pretty diversified indices that, eliminated a few things that were deemed to be unsustainable. I'm not, going to go into too much detail on what exactly they've eliminated or not, but ultimately, when you are using some sort of sustainability screen with a portfolio, it does make a difference overall in terms of the return that you can achieve. And then at the same time, too, in times where things are relatively volatile, it tends to outperform. It tends to be a little bit stronger. So that is the idea, that we want to make sure that we hang on to that wealth. So something that we can do today, and I encourage you all to make sure that you do this, is just in your lives and in your careers and everything that you do, make sure to encourage quality research. Also encourage data transparency. If you happen to be in a field where there's sharing data and sharing information that might actually benefit the field, could be considered, or is possible, make sure that happens. It can only benefit everybody. And then also consider all the sources and context that are related to ESG. There's a lot of information out there, and I know that depending on where you look, where you read, sometimes there are individuals who are very interested in sustainable investing. They absolutely despise the term ESG, and there's reasons why. And then there's some that, on the complete other side, don't like ESG, and then they don't like sustainable investing too. Ask yourselves questions, ask yourselves why, look at where their sources are coming from, and try and figure out what they're reading and why. Ultimately, when you start to look at little snippets and put together the big pieces of the puzzle, you see a picture emerge, and the emergence of that picture is that ESG really is quite useful in understanding economic structures and the usefulness of criteria for investments. Support efforts to create national and international frameworks and standards, because there is no international framework or standard around this. That would ultimately solve the quality issue in some capacity. There are a lot of frameworks that are coming out of the EU, the SFDR, the TCFD. We do have a lot of them that we work with in our team, creating questionnaires that are meant to help companies focus their efforts on reaching and achieving those frameworks. So encourage those. If you happen to work in policy or legal situations, supporting and encouraging the development of those frameworks is really important. And then lastly, supporting education in sustainable investing. If you happen to go on to business school or have friends that go on to business school, encourage programs, if you happen to stay involved as an alumni, make sure that there is, going to be some kind of education program in sustainable investing for the next generation going forward. The interest is there, but unfortunately the outreach for it and the breadth of information on it is just not reaching as many folks as I'd like. And then just very lastly, my last little bit on Ethos, ethosesg.com, if you ever want to go there and check this out. One of the most fun pieces of this is we have a questionnaire that you can go through and discover what your impact persona is. Mine actually, we put it in our little bios on the website for our team. I'm an inclusive Earth innovator. That's my focus, because I like focusing on nature, and I also like focusing on equitable economies at the same time. So you can answer this questionnaire and look at areas that might be of interest to you. You might discover something that you didn't know that you were interested in previously. The idea really is to take a look at the issues of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We just kind of recategorize them a little bit. They're ultimately the same definitions. They're just worded slightly differently. We have 10 primary causes with 35 different sub-causes that ultimately determine an investor's impact persona. And then based on their impact persona, this is how we can develop a portfolio around that individual's interest in impact. So it's not eliminating things from a portfolio per se. What it does is it's making sure that companies that are doing those things that you care about are the ones that get priority in your portfolio. And not saying that you got to subscribe to Ethos or anything like that. This is tools specifically for advisors, wealth managers, asset managers, big firms, but we do have a free version that the public actually uses quite a bit. Let's say you are shopping and there's a brand that you've never heard of. You can actually, we have this quite a bit where customers will search for that brand on Ethos and find out what their impact score is, how they are viewed on a climate perspective or social perspective. And we want the public to make sure about that. One big thing that attracted to me to Ethos in the first place, I'll note that on there, is that we're 100% transparent with the ESG data. There's not a single data point on that site that we can't tell you where it came from, how it's calculated, and we won't, be open about that. We won't make you pay for it either to tell you how we came up with that answer. So that's the main thing that led me to Ethos in the first place, is I think we're one of the few data providers that's willing to do that and not, charge the public or anybody an arm and a leg to find that information out. So just, is one thing. It's not that hard to do. You can actually make sure that the data is super transparent and, encourage the public to become better consumers. So we're, better investors, but at the same time, better consumers overall. So I think I got a couple minutes to spare, so happy to answer any questions for you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Really appreciate that. Really in-depth presentation, and I'm happy that we'll be able to share the slides with the fellows afterwards, as there were quite a few questions and a very active chat going back and forth with some resources going in there. One of the questions that I'd love to highlight, there's two that were in the chat that I'd love to bring up. From your experience, where are you seeing some of the most widely ESG standards or the regulatory frameworks? Like, what are you seeing as the most widely popular ones so that the fellows could go deeper into those and research more? And then in the interest of time, I'll bring up the second question, which is how do we sort of align financial incentives and these regulatory frameworks to encourage more adoption of sustainable finance? That's more of a question from your own professional background, where you see how where do things sort of align with that? And then I'll open it up to the fellows if there's any more questions that they can jump in and share their own voices.
Sure, absolutely. So I can combine actually those two questions. So the one framework that I cite quite a bit that can be used actually broadly across the globe. I mean, I did cite there are a few that the European Union has used within their member states, but the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, has created a set of material standards that they have used for, I believe, 72 different industries. What they basically have done is determined what factors would be most of a problem in different sectors. So, you know, an airline's risk are different from a restaurant, or different from an oil company, or different from a retail shop. And they determine which of those ESG related issues would be most financially detrimental. And so they've come up with, okay, a company in this sector needs to report this information to shareholders. If they don't, that's going to be, you know, a big issue across the globe in terms of trust, and then also, you know, going to affect shareholder value. So that framework, SASB, the SAB, wait, no, SA, yeah, SAB, you get it. SASB, sorry, my gosh, it's a long day. Their framework for material factors is really good. So they're part of a broader international organization now. So I think their reach is a lot more across the globe. I think I forget their acronym for their international group now, but you can view those on their site, the details for all of their criteria. And that is too another great thing about them is it's all publicly available as well. So hopefully that gives you a good idea as a starting point for a framework. No matter what industry you go in, you can actually find out what those material factors are. Hope that helps. IFRS, yes, thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. Are there any questions from the group?
And like you mentioned, I'll be sure to send you a copy of these slides so you can have them for your reference if you need them.
Yeah. Thanks, Maria, for putting in the chat also the different acronyms that are coming together with IFRS, SASB, and the ISSB. It's an acronym soup, isn't it, Jenny? And in your work teaching this, you have to kind of go through all of them.
I know, and I didn't want to overwhelm you all with slides on those. So just so you know, there are many out there, but yeah, maybe that's another conversation for another day, or just all the acronyms.
Katya, please jump in.
Yeah, hi Jenny. First of all, thanks for that very insightful presentation.
You're welcome.
You already said there are some difference, for example, how ESG reporting or ESG issues are addressed in Europe and in other countries. Do you know of any leader, for example, a country where these things are going especially well, or a region of the world where you say, oh, there it's like they are at the front of the in these things?
No, that's a great question. So there are, and what it's become actually is the frameworks that are being adopted by a lot of the EU countries are becoming useful actually for a lot of foreign investors, for them to see kind of, how it's possible for businesses to report on these factors and not have it be, detrimental to the company somehow. I don't have them in this presentation, but in another one I gave, there were France about 20 years ago had some pretty strict requirements in terms of how they wanted environmental factors reported by specific industries. And in some cases, if they didn't give the statistics behind those factors, they wanted information on why they couldn't do that. So to give a reason. And the countries that are doing that, there's actually quite a few these days that have one of these. It's called comply or explain. And it's not just Europe that's doing these. There's, I believe, Australia and a few Southeast Asian countries have started to adopt this, where they'll, come up with a strategy of saying, okay, a company is either going to comply with this requirement of reporting, or they're going to explain themselves. And generally, they don't want to explain themselves, so they're just going to comply. So that strategy actually works quite well in a lot of cases. But of course, there's a lot of criteria, right? So there's not one country, unfortunately, that's got it perfectly so far. And of course, I know that we're kind of running out of time in terms of, reaching the UN's mission of matching those or meeting those sustainable development goals by 2030. So we're trying. But there are a lot of countries in Europe, particularly France and particularly the UK, and I believe Denmark too, are the three I would say that have some legislation specifically that you can look at that have done really well in terms of reporting. But the EU broadly has some good requirement frameworks that have been working.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I've had the impression that France is also in other ecological issues very much at the forefront.
You're welcome. Anything else?
Well, Jenny, thank you so much for your time. This has been really, really informative. I'm really appreciating you coming back and sharing with us this presentation, giving such a broad overview of the industry and some great resources for the fellows to go deeper into this. It's definitely been inspiring.
Very welcome.
Yeah. So thank you very much all for joining, and we hope to see you again on the next event. Thank you again, Jenny.
You're very welcome, guys. Take care. Thank you.
Cheers. Have a good night.